Assalamu alaikum. We will begin with our lecture 13th today. In the last lecture, I concluded the discussion on Shelley's poetry. We studied and analyzed his two poems, his two odes, one called Ode to the West Wind and the other Ode to a Skylark. I also discussed with you the various themes that emerged from his both poems, and we looked at the various ways we could analyze and study his poetry. Today we will begin with another poet, and he was a contemporary of Shelley. Both of them belong to the younger group of Romantic poets. Keats died young also. He was the youngest of this group of poets, and he was a sensitive soul. He was also troubled by diseases, by the disease of tuberculosis in his time, in his lifetime. And that was why he always lived in fear of death, and in fact he saw death as imminent. We shall see how Keats's own life influenced his poem, his work, and how he is a different kind of a Romantic poet from the Romantic poets that we have been studying so far. He is different. His Romanticism is different from that of Wordsworth. It is different from that of Coleridge. It is different from that of Shelley, the three Romantic poets that you have studied. And as you shall see today, that he brings his own idea of Romanticism to poetry. And he enriches this movement that we call Romanticism with his own unique personality and with his own unique style of creating art. So let us see how this young poet, John Keats, he lived his life first. We shall take a brief look at his life, and then I will discuss the kind of poetry that he produced. And then we will go on to look at and analyze his first ode that is part of your course, and which is Ode on a Grecian. Now Keats, like I just told you, was always in fear of death. He was suffering from tuberculosis. He knew his death was imminent. He had seen deaths in his own family. He's seen the death of his mother. He's seen the death of his younger brother, and both from tuberculosis. Since he also suffered from the disease, he knew that his death was imminent. He knew that he would die young. He had high goals. He had set high targets for himself. He wanted to be a great poet, but nevertheless this fear of shortness of life always haunted him, and we find it in his poetry also, in his poems also. That is why we sometimes describe him as a melancholic figure. He had a melancholic temperament, and it was due to the experiences in his life. And the other experience that may have resulted in this temperament was due to his experiences at a hospital, at a Guy hospital, where he worked as a dresser, who had to change the clothes of people who had been operated upon. The ugliness and the cruelty that he saw in the hospitals visibly moved him, and all of it contributed to that melancholic temperament that is so much visible in his poems. And we also know, and you should also remember, that he died very young. He died at the age of 25, and by this time he had only 54 of his poems published out of the 150 that he had written. And it is also important that you know that he had to undergo a lot of criticism on his work also. Some of the poems that he had published in the last year of his life had been criticized severely by critics, by the critical reviews in magazines, and Keats was highly depressed as a result of those criticisms. So he could not get all of his works published in his lifetime, and they were later on published after his death. But his popularity as a poet increased as that of Shelley or Byron's after his death. We shall see that his poetry is characterized by the sensual imagery, and especially in the odes that we are going to study. Wordsworth was also sensuous, Coleridge to an extent also, Shelley too, but with Keats we shall see that he involves all senses when he is creating images for you. In his ode, his most famous ode, Ode to Autumn, which you may have studied already or you may be familiar with it, it makes use of all senses, and it is the use of that sensuous imagery that gives it a beautiful harmonic atmosphere. Some of the major themes in his works, it is important that we look at them too, and some of them are transience of life and the inevitability of death. This theme we will come across this theme in almost all of his poems. He always felt that life is short, it is too short, and death was inevitable, so he always lived in fear of death, and this is something that he always mentions or talks about in most of his poems. Another prominent theme in his works is contemplation of beauty. Beauty for him, as he says somewhere, a thing of beauty is a joy forever. So for him, beauty in nature, beauty of faces, beauty in a human character, beauty anywhere, beauty of whatever kind, it impresses him most. So he looks for beauty, he contemplates on beauty. And most of his works are also inspired from beauty. Another theme in his work is Hellenism. Hellenism is a term that we use for Greek art and literature. We shall see that Keats was immensely impressed by Greek art and Greek literature. And he writes about Greek art and literature. He talks about Greek gods and goddesses. We shall find a lot of Greek references. We shall find a lot of references to Greek gods and goddesses in his poems. So it is his Hellenism that is also a significant theme of his works. Then another important thing is reverie and getting lost in the ideal world. This is very common with Keats. He likes to go into a reverie, he likes to go into a dream world, and he then gets lost into that dream world that he's created. And he dissociates himself from the real world and is completely, completely becomes part of that ideal world that he has created. And that is how he's able to bring out his intense emotions when he talks about that ideal world. And related to this theme is his concept of negative capability, which he defines himself, and I will discuss it with you in detail towards the end of the lecture. But it is his negative capability that is another important theme in his works, and it is the ability of the poet to dissociate himself from the real world completely and to become so absorbed into the object that he's focusing on, or become part of that world that he has immersed himself in, that he completely forgets about anything that is occurring outside that world. For him, only that object or only that world exists, and it is the emotion inspired and created when in that state of mind, which Keats believes holds the truth, and it is in that state that poet can spell out truth. So for him, in a way, we can see a poet also plays a significant role because of his ability, because of this ability of his of negative capability. The poet is at a higher level from the common individuals. Because of his power of imagination, due to his power of imagination, he can enter into a world, into a domain, and become part of that world or domain, which is an ideal world, and become forgetful of the real actual world of us mortals. So this negative capability is a result of the acute imagination of the poet, and it plays an important role as far as the poets and the worth of the poet's art is concerned, because in that state of emotions, when a poet is aroused or is taken hold of by the negative capability, whatever comes out of his mind or mouth, it is true. It is the ultimate truth. Because at that state, in that state, the poet is not bowed down, the poet is not disturbed by the problems, worries, fears of this world. So it is an important theme in his works. Another important thing is the sensuous imagery, which I've discussed with you already, and last of all, the permanence of art. We shall see Keats, when speaking of the transience of life, of this life, he speaks about the permanence of art, that art is permanent, art is for all times, but humans, they are mortal, they are not for all times, and their passions, their feelings, the youth, their love, that they are not permanent. We shall also see that Keats also believed that when the poet leaves this world and enters into that ideal world, he gets lost into that ideal world, but when he returns with a better understanding of the world. He returns a maturer person. That is why I have written here for you that in many of his poems, the speaker leaves the real world to explore a mythical or aesthetic realm and returns at the end with a better understanding. We shall see this happening in the two odes that I shall study with you, Ode on a Grecian Urn and Ode to a Nightingale. You shall see that he leaves and enters into a world of the unknown, into a world that you and I are not familiar with. But when he returns with a better understanding. He returns with a maturer thoughts. So let's look at the negative capability now. What is this concept of negative capability that is so famously attached to Keats? It is the ability to get lost in a reverie, to leave the conscious life for imaginative life, without wondering about rationality. This is Keats' concept of negative capability. He believes that you leave this conscious life and you enter into an imaginative life, and you are not thinking rationally. You are carried on the wings of emotions, on the wings of feelings when you are in that world. The poet totally gives up his personal identity. He forgets who he is, he forgets where he is, and his own personal identity is negated. It is completely forgotten. It is completely given up. And he focuses with all its intensity on the object that he is studying, on the object that he is writing. If the Keats is inspired by the Grecian urn that he sees before him, he will forget himself, he will forget where he is, he will forget his worries, and he will only focus on the object and its world, on the urn and its world. And similarly, when he is talking about the nightingale, and how the song of the nightingale inspires him so much that he enters into the world of the nightingale. He leaves his own self, he leaves his own world behind, and he becomes wholeheartedly a part of that world. So the object becomes the symbolic of intense emotions. And only in that state, it is only that emotion which is important. So the imagination is led on by association with that object, with that desired object. And then emotions are heightened, they're created, and they become important. And as a result of those emotions, the poet is able to see into the reality of things. He is able to see into the true value of things. So Keats rejected the artist's attempt to analyze, rationalize, or categorize the world, or to pass any judgments. you shall see that he will take you on the wings of emotions and on the wings of feelings. He does not try to rationalize like Shelley does. He does not even try to categorize like Wordsworth does. So he is inspired by an object of nature. He's inspired by an object that he beholds, but he does not rationalize or categorize them or try even to analyze them or his association with that object, but he gets lost in the beauty of that object, into the beautiful world of that object. You can maybe compare it to the experience that you had with Kubla Khan, where Coleridge is talking of the dream that he saw, and when he is describing that dream to you, he's lost into that world of Kubla Khan. He's lost in that savage, at the same time, the beautiful place. So we see that Coleridge has completely given up his personality for that imaginary world that he has created. We do not see or hear the voice of the poet anywhere in the poem. So similarly, this is what Keats believed. He believed that poet is invisible in his poem. It has to be invisible in his poem, and he cannot pass any judgments. He also this negative capability can also be compared to the aesthetic objectivity. It can be described in terms of aesthetic objectivity. Aesthetic, since you must be familiar with, aestheticism has to do with the appreciation of beauty. So aesthetic objectivity, and objectivity means when you can dissociate yourself from something. When you stand aside and you look at an object and you forget your own self, you forget your own beliefs, you forget your own feelings, you forget your own fears, and you're only looking objectively at that object. So Keats' theory of negative capability is concerned with particular state of poetic receptivity that makes literary creation possible. So it is under the effect of negative capability that a work of literature, that a piece of literature is possible, that a literary creation is possible. So just like Coleridge says that a poet under the effect of secondary imagination can create the piece of poem, Wordsworth here says that it is negative capability that eventually makes creation possible. Now I'm going to read out the few lines that Keats himself wrote on his idea of negative capability in a letter to his brother George in December 1817. He contends. He says, "The excellence of every art is its intensity." The excellence of every art, he says, is its intensity. And you shall see that in his poems this intensity is paramount. You can feel his emotions, you can feel his intense emotions. He will carry you, like I said, on the wings of emotions and feelings, and when you enter his world, you will have to leave your rational mind behind. You can only understand through your intense emotions or feelings. And if you can't feel, if you cannot have your emotions aroused, then you will leave Keats' world without having understood anything about his world. So he says the excellence of every art is its intensity. Art is supposed to create intense emotions in their reader, capable of making all disagreeables evaporate. So, and another function of art is to like Coleridge says, is to make all disagreeables evaporate, to resolve all conflicts. It is to resolve all contradictions from their being in close relationship with beauty and truth. And how is it possible? How are those intense emotions or those disagreeables, contradictions removed? He says because of the poet being in close relationship with beauty and truth. And these two words are highly significant because for Keats they were very important. His poetry is all about beauty and truth. So he says that because the poet is because the art itself is in close relationship with beauty and truth. Art is beautiful, and that is why Keats says it's also truthful. It is in close association with the two. So he says the poet is able to resolve the conflicts. I mean negative capability. That is when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. With a great poet, the sense of beauty overcomes every other consideration, or rather obliterates all consideration. So all the uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, he says, all reasoning, all facts are removed when the poet is in that state of negative capability. And then he says, for a poet, the sense of beauty is highly important, is very important. And we are going to, when we study the poem, you are going to see how all that Keats has just explained, how it comes true in his work. So here for you I have explained this process of negative capability which Keats has explained. So in his words, this process of negative capability, it can be broken down into the following stages. First is the stage is when the imagination communicates an intense emotion. When the poet sees a beautiful object, he is taken into the world of imagination which arouses in him intense emotion. Then the poet gives up the personal identity to focus on the object that he is describing. His own self is left behind and he only focuses on the object. And then as a result, the object becomes symbolic of these intense emotions. Then the object is linked to his emotions. We cannot separate the object from his emotions because it becomes a symbol of his emotions. It is the object that is now causing those emotions. Then all other matters not important to these emotions are sidelined. The poet only lives for those emotions, for that object. And everything else is sidelined. It is ignored. The poem's beauty or truth, a combination of poetic emotion and perceived object. And at the end we shall see that the beauty of the poem, or beauty of the art, or the truth value of the poem, or the truth value of the art, these are the result of those poetic emotions and the attachment of the poet with the object or the perceived object. So both of these result in the beauty of the poem and add the truth value to that poem. And thus the poem is a subjective truth. It may not be an objective truth, but it is subjective truth because the poet is taken to that heightened state, and whatever he says in that heightened state, it is his truth value. So the poem has a subjective truth value, which we shall also find in this poem that we are going to study today, Ode on a Grecian Urn. So before we begin with the ode, let's briefly look at what the poem is about. Now the urn, if we take the same idea of negative capability, because we are discussing it, I will first discuss that in the light of the ode, because if for Keats negative capability is the ability of the poet to dissociate himself from the real world and to become part of that imaginary world. The urn in Ode to a Grecian Urn is an object which speaks a truth and a beauty, but that truth and beauty are understood by the negative capability of the artist. So we shall see that the urn also, it speaks a truth and a beauty. It is going to tell you a tale, a beautiful tale, a tale of beauty, and it is going to give you a message which is based on truth. So the poem has a truth value, and this truth value and this beauty, they are understood because of the negative capability of the artist, because he is able to become part of that world. The urn's message of beauty and truth are at the end of the poem, which we shall find are open-ended, and they are the message is open-ended and mysterious, and it's often debated upon. The lines, last two lines of the poem, which are often discussed and often debated, are beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know. We are going to discuss the lines in detail later on, but it was just to give you an idea how negative capability is part of Keats's poems. So it is in this order that he's supposed to have written these odes, but again, as I said, we cannot be sure. In this poem too, we shall see him talking about his philosophy of art, beauty and love. In the other odes also he talks about these, but we shall come across them in this poem. He talks about his idea of art, the idea of the immortality of art, his idea of the everlasting nature of art, and his idea of beauty and his idea of love. The poem is written in 10-line stanzas in iambic pentameter with a rhyme scheme of A, B, A, B, C, D, E and C, D, E. And it is thus Horatian. It is the kind of an ode, Horatian is a kind of an ode which is written with one stanza form alone, and as you shall see, the poem is written in 4 or 5 stanzas, and all stanzas contain 10 lines each, and they have similar rhyme scheme too. So let's start with stanza 1. Let us look at how Keats's ideas, how his philosophy of art, of love, of life, of beauty, of truth, they are all discussed in this poem. So let us begin with the line-by-line analysis of the poem. Stanza 1. I hope you remember that you have to keep in mind that the poem is inspired after Keats saw an urn. After Keats saw this beautiful urn, this piece of vase, beautifully carved and with beautiful pictures etched on it, which was a beautiful piece of art reminding him of the great Greek period. It was in this painting, or this painting of the vase, or this sculpture of the vase that he saw. It was handed down, it was copied from the Greeks. The Romans copied the Greek art, and then the Romans were copied by the English artists, and it was how it had been preserved. So maybe in a museum Keats came across this urn, and when he saw the urn, he was captured by the engravings, by the pictures that he saw on the body of the urn, and he was so captivated by what he saw that he decided to write the poem on it. He decided to talk about his own feelings and emotions while describing to you the pictures on the urn, while describing to you the world of the urn. And when he describes to you this world of the urn, he does not talk about, he does not compare it. Although we as readers do, we cannot dissociate ourselves from our own world. So we keep on comparing. But Keats nowhere does that. He does not compare that world of the urn, the world of the peoples who are etched, who are engraved on the body of the urn. He does not compare their world or their lives to our lives, but we keep on comparing. So he is going to describe to you the world of the urn. He makes alive for us the pictures that he sees on the urn. So he creates for us, or he takes us into a world which is different from ours, and that is what he aims to explain here. So let us begin with the lines. In the first stanza, he is describing the urn to you. He calls it with different names. He says, "Thou still unravished bride of quietness, the foster child of silence and slow time. He calls the urn by two names here. First, he calls it the unravished bride of quietness. The unravished bride of quietness. It is the bride which is at the center of the phrase. He calls it unravished. Unravished is an untouched, a new bride who's just being bride. So it is still fresh, it is still new. But he calls the urn the bride of quietness. The bride is married to quietness. So quietness, in a way, although it is not written with a capital Q, but it is in a way personified. The urn itself is personified. He's calling it a bride. So the metaphor that he uses for it is that of a bride. So it is the unravished, it is a fresh, it is a new bride of quietness. Quiet because it remains in a place which is quiet. The urn lies in a museum, and it tells a quiet tale of its own. So it lives in quietness, and it is a quietness that inspires the poet. You shall see that Keats throughout the poem is going to associate this idea of quietness, this idea of silence with the urn. So in the very first line he calls it the unravished bride of quietness, and then he calls it with another title. He says the foster child of silence and slow time. Now the urn has become the foster child. It is a child which is reared up, which is reared by the foster parents, but the foster parents are silence and slow time. So the foster parents of the urn are, as he tells us, are silence, and they are slow time. Silence and slow time. Because in the world of the urn, the time does not change, the time does not pass. That is why he's calling it slow time, as opposed to our world where things are changing, where youth becomes old, where the healthy become sick and die, where the flower blooms for a while and then dies, where beauty lives for a short while and then, ugliness or age old takes over. So in our world things are changing, but in the world of the urn or the pictures on the urn, they don't change. And the time passes so slowly that there is hardly any change. And then secondly, he says, you're the foster child of silence too. Again silence. So he says, because you are always enveloped in silence. So he's imagining a permanent state of unconsumed passion. He says, in this urn, in the world of urn, everything remains forever. Everything is permanent. It is for all times. It is forever. And the passion is always unconsumed. It is not consumed and then gone and over with, but it is unconsumed. There's always energy. There's always blood throbbing through the veins. There is always feelings, emotions. There's no death of emotions, feelings. So there's always a state of unconsumed passion. And next we see that he calls it the sylvan historian, who can't thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme. He says, you are also the sylvan historian. Now he leaves that talk about silence behind, and he calls it an object that can tell, that has its own tale to tell, that has its own stories to tell. He calls it sylvan historian, where we get the idea that it is old. It is as old as the world itself. It has seen generations coming and going. So it is a sylvan historian. It has so many tales to tell. But he says, who can't thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme. But this historian, he says, can tell a flowery tale, can tell a tale more sweetly than our poems can, than our arts can. This you may also say a tribute to the Greek literature again, once again. For Keats, Greek art, Greek culture, Greek literature, it was a supreme literature, supreme art, and it had to be emulated, followed by the later generations. So that was the epitome of high culture, high values for Keats. This is why he says that what comes from the Greek sources, that is much more influence bearing, and it is much more powerful than our own tales. This can be another interpretation of these lines. Then he says, what leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape, of deities or mortals, or of both, in Tempe or the dales of Arcady? What leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape? Now he's, a vase is shaped like this. So he's, and on the body of the vase, he can see the vines covered in leaves. He can see the vines which are drawn, etched, painted on the body of the urn, and all of them, all the vines covered with green leaves. He says they seem to hide a tale, they seem to hide a legend, they seem to hide a story. Of what? He says, of deities or of mortals, of gods, deities or gods, or of mortals, or us humans, or of both, or of both humans and gods. And what may be the setting, he says? What is it? Is it the Tempe or the dales of Arcady? The valleys in Greek, or the temples in Greek. So he's imagining what tales, what stories, what legend may be hidden under those thick leaves that are etched, that are drawn on the body of the urn. What men or gods are these? Now here he's talking specifically of the pictures or the drawings on the urn, and we get a glimpse of those different kinds of it. He says he sees some figures of people, and he cannot decide whether these are gods or these are men. He says, what are they? Are they god or are they men? What maiden's lot? Lot means to loathe, to hate. So he says, why are these maidens? Why are these young girls? Who are these young girls running away from? Loathing, running away from what mad pursuit? So maybe he sees figures, paintings, where these men or these gods, whoever they may be, they are chasing girls. They're trying to capture those girls. They're trying to get hold of those girls. And he describes them and calls them as mad pursuit, because they are running after them, and girls are running away from them. What struggle to escape? So you see, he talks of pursuit, the act of running towards someone, and escape, the act of running away from someone. So he's describing it using different words, making it forceful for you, and for you to be able to imagine it and to see it through your mind's eye. He says, what pipes and timbrels? Then he also sees some people standing by, playing with pipes, or with, pipe is a flute and timbrels are the small drums. What wild ecstasy? That is, ecstasy is the extreme form of joy and complete surrender to that state. So he says, upon the faces of those people that he sees on the urn, he says, I find wild ecstasy, the extreme surrender to that feeling of joy and happiness, and an extreme emotion of joy and happiness, because they are in a world where nothing changes, where the happy state will stays for a long time. And the happy state is not taken over and replaced by the sad thoughts. So this was stanza 1, where he addresses the urn, gives it different titles, describes to you the different scenes which are etched on the body of the urn. In stanza 2, he is going to describe to you those scenes in a little bit of detail. He says, heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. The songs, he says, which we hear, they are sweet, but he says those songs that are unheard, because the songs that the figures are etched on the urn are playing, he says they are never heard of by our generation, because they belong to the older generation, to the times that we are not aware of. He says, so their songs are new to us, so they are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes, play on. So he asked these musicians to keep on playing their flutes, because theirs is the music for the soul. Their music is heard only by the soul. It is not heard by the sensuous ear, it is heard and felt by the soul, and it is sweeter than the heard songs or heard musics. Not to the sensual ear, but more endeared, pipe to the spirit deities of no tone. He says, you should play on, you should keep on playing your music, because you don't play to the sensual ear. We don't hear your music through our physical ear, but we only hear it through our love for you. He says, and you so play on, pipe to the spirit deities of no tone. Keep on singing these short songs, and let your flute keep on composing music that is a music for the soul. So this is one picture that he describes to you, where the musicians are playing their flute, and he is asking them, and he's saying that their music is much more beautiful and sweeter than the music of maybe our world, the mortal's world, because that at the end of it, we know there can be some tragedy. Then he says, fair youth, beneath the trees thou canst not leave thy song, nor ever can those trees be bare. Now he's talking about a beautiful lad, a young handsome lad. He says, O you fair youth who are lying beneath the trees, or lying under the trees, you cannot leave thy song. So this young lad is lying under the tree and is singing for his beloved. He's singing maybe a love song for his beloved, and is so wrapped in his singing that he's not aware of what is happening around him. But he says that, Keats says that he must go on singing. He will go on singing. His heart will always be full of passion, and will always be full of longing. It will always be full of love, and he will never leave his song. In the same way, he says, the trees will never be bare. The trees will never shed their trees. There will never be autumn. There will never be death for them. So nothing in the world of the urn changes. Then the bold lover, he tells you there is also a picture of a bold lover on the urn. And he's a bold lover because he says, never, never canst thou kiss. He uses it twice, he says, because he can never kiss. He can never fulfill his desire, his heart's desire to be able to kiss his beloved. He's in the act of catching his beloved and trying to kiss her, but the picture is etched like that on the urn, and the kiss will never be consumed. It will never actually take place. He says, though winning near the goal yet, do not grieve. He says, but you should never grieve. You should not be disheartened. Why? Because he says, at least your love will forever be young. You may not be able to kiss your beloved. You may not be able to experience that bliss, but he says, at least your love for your beloved will always stay young. Why? Because he says, she cannot fade. Though thou hast not thy bliss, forever wilt thou love, and she be fair. He says, why will your love always remain young? He says, because she cannot fade. Because she will never grow old. She will never leave you. She will never turn ugly. Whatever meaning you want to take from it. Though thou hast not thy bliss. He says, although, fear not, don't be grieved that you have not attained your goal. You have not been blessed with the happiness of kissing your beloved, he says. But still, she will always be there. She will not fade away. She will not leave you. She will not cheat you. She will not turn ugly. She will always be loyal to you. She will always be fair to you. Forever will thou love, and she be fair. You will always love her, and that is important. And she will always stay young and beautiful, and that is important. So he tells the lover, the bold lover who is daring to catch his beloved and to kiss her, he says, you shall not grieve, because your love will always remain young, and that is what matters. And she will always remain loyal to you and beautiful, and that is important. And so in this second stanza, you saw how he describes the three pictures that he's seeing. He's talking about musicians who are playing their music. He talks about a young boy who's singing his song. He talks about the trees above, which are always green, who will never lose their greenery or the beauty or the crown of leaves that they have. And then he's talking about this couple where the lover is trying to kiss his beloved. So he describes these images, these pictures, the drawings on the urn to you, and he wants to tell you how this world is unique. Then in the third stanza, he's going to elaborate upon the same pictures that he's just described. He says, ah, happy, happy boughs. Now once again he's talking about those trees. Boughs are the branches of the trees. He's talking about the branches of the trees, and he says, ah, happy, happy boughs. The boughs are happy, that cannot shed your leaves nor ever bid the spring adieu. And why are they happy? Why are the trees happy? Why are the branches happy? He says, because you can never shed your leaves. You can never bid the spring adieu. There is always spring in the world of urn. It will never taste autumn. It will never taste winter, the season of death. There will always be spring in the world of urn. The branches will forever be green. So Keats is envying these branches. This is why he emphasizes or he plays emphasis on the word happy. He says happy, happy. Ah, you see this the pain, the feeling of pain with which he says it. He says, ah, happy, happy boughs. So even the branches are happy, happy. So he's envying them their lasting happiness, their fertility and their beauty. And happy melodist, forever piping songs, forever new. Now the melodist, the musician, he describes the musician as also happy. And why is he happy? He's happy because he will always be making new songs. He will always be composing new songs. Since he will never taste sorrow, since he will never taste tensions, since he will never age, so he will never stop composing. His ideas will always be rich and young. So he will always be untired. He will never be unwearied, he says. So he is forever young, forever fresh, forever creative, forever piping songs, forever new. And the songs will always be new. Why? Because every time there is a new generation of humans which will be listening to this song, which will be listening to his songs, which will be looking at the urn. So every time there will be a different individual experiencing these things. So the song will always remain fresh and new, because although it will not change, but the generations of mankind, they change. The song stays forever while a generation of humans is replaced by another. So in this way the beauty or the music of the urn stays fresh and forever new. Then he says, more happy love. Now he calls love happy. Remember the couple? He's talking about them. He says, more happy love, more happy, happy love. Again, the emphasis is on happy. The love is also happy. In this world, he said, he says, love is also happy. Forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever panting and forever young. So in the world of the urn, love doesn't change. It always stays young and it always stays warm. It was always to be enjoyed, and it is always wanting It is always young. It is never satisfied. It never tastes a cheat from the beloved. It never tastes the agony of separation. It never tastes ugliness. It never tastes indifference. It is always young. It is always warm. It is always panting, as he says. It is always to be enjoyed. It always is a source of pleasure. So love, as in the mortal world of mortal, as Keats experienced it, did not leave a bad taste in the mouth. All breathing human passion far above, that leaves a heart high, sorrowful, and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. Now he says, he's now comparing this love of the urn, in the world of the urn, with the love that is experienced by the mortals, the humans. He says, all breathing human passion far above. So the human passion, the human love, he says, it leaves behind a heart which is high, sorrowful, and cloyed, and a burning forehead and a parching tongue. The love here, he says, it leaves us a heart which is full of sorrow. It leaves a sorrowful heart. It leaves a burning forehead. He says it leaves us with pain in our head. It leaves us with a headache. It leaves us with a feverish feeling. And it leaves us with a parching tongue, with the thirstiness in our tongue. So the passion, the human passion, he says, it is all too soon over. It is all too soon consumed. And the man or human is left with these feelings. The feeling of sorrow, the feeling of feverish, feeling feverish, and the parching tongue. So these are the result of the passion of humans. So this is what he says is inferior to the love experienced in the world of the urn. In the stanza 4, the scene changes. He now describes to you a totally different scene. The scene is that of a deserted village and that of a sacrifice. So first he describes to you a sacrifice, the sacrificial scene. He says, who are these coming to the sacrifice? To what green altar? Oh, mysterious priests. So see, the vocabulary is also religious. He's talking about altar, green altar. He's talking about priests. So people are leading a goat, as he shall tell you in the next lines. They're leading a ram to sacrifice at the altar. So it is a religious ceremony which is also etched, which is also drawn on the urn. Leadest thou that heifer, lowing at the skies, and all her silken flanks with garlands dressed. So he says, who are these people who are leading? Who are leading the heifer, that young ram, who is lowing, who's bellowing by looking at the sky and looking at the skies, looking above, he says. They're leading this young ram. Who are these people who are leading this young ram to the altar for sacrifice? And all her body, all her flanks are covered with garlands, are decorated with flowers. And we know that sacrificial animals, the animals which are to be offered for sacrifice, they are normally covered with flowers and garlands. He says, what little town by river or seashore or mountain built with peaceful cathedral is emptied of this folk, this pious morn? Now he describes to you a small village or like a town that is drawn on the urn. He says, this little town is maybe it is by a river or it is a seashore. The poet is not sure, but there is some water near this town. Or he says that a mountain built with peaceful cathedral, or he sees in the background a cathedral which is a fortress, or this little town is on top of a mountain, or it is part of a peaceful fortress, is emptied of this folk, this pious morning. He says, but why is it that this town or this village is empty? There are no folks around, there are no people around. But then he answers it himself. He says, maybe this is a pious morning. This is some holy day. This is some holy occasion. And maybe all the villagers have gone for that sacrificial ceremony. This is why the whole town is deserted. It is emptied. And little town, thy streets for evermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou art desolate can ever return. And as similar, in the same way as he described to you all the earlier scenes, he says, in the same way, this little town, this little village, with its emptied streets, it will always remain silent. There will be no change. It will always remain desolate. It will always remain deserted. There will be no people around, because they will never return to their homes. They will not come back from where they have gone to. So this is another scene that he describes, but he describes to you the permanence of the scene, just like the permanence of the loving couple, or the permanence of the young lad singing, or the permanence of the musicians playing, or the permanence of the trees never shedding their leaves. He's talking about the permanence of this emptied village. It will never be filled up with people. It will remain desolate. And so here we find a sense of deep meditation. In the last stanza of the poem, Keats is going to conclude with those famous lines of his. He says, "O Attic shape." He calls the urn the Attic shape. He calls it the Attic because Attic was one of the city in the old Greece. And maybe the urn had been, the first drawing of the urn was made in the Greek city. So he calls it with its original name. He calls it the Attic shape. Then he also calls it the fair attitude. He calls it an abstract form, although it has a physical form, but Keats uses the word abstract for the urn. But you may also link it to the beauty, because it was an object of beauty for Keats. So he calls it the fair attitude, the beautiful piece of art. He says, "With brede of marble men and maidens overwrought, with forest branches and the trodden weed." Now he's here describing to you all the scenes that are drawn on the urn, that are etched on the urn. He says there are drawings of men, there are drawings of women, and there are drawings of forests, branches of trees, and there is trodden weed. All of that which we have just discussed. So he's just concluding. So he is encapsulating for you the whole of the scene again. And then he says, "Thou silent form." He once again addresses the urn, and he calls it with the initial title. It's the silent form. He says, "Dost tease us out of thought as doth eternity." Cold pastoral. The silence of the urn, actually, he believes it takes us out, or it arouses in us thoughts of deep sensation. They cause man to meditate. They cause man to think about serious issues, as Keats here mentions of eternity. He says the silence of the urn, it allows us, it leads us to think about eternity, to think about human condition, to think about life after death. And that is why Keats here calls the urn the cold pastoral, because the scenes that are etched on the urn, they are of beautiful scenes. They are valleys which are beautiful and green and which are lovely. There are musicians playing. There is a picture of a couple. There is a picture of a young lad singing, and there are young maidens, and there are young gods, as he calls them. So this is a beautiful scene that is etched on the urn, but Keats also calls it cold, because the thoughts that it leads to, the deep meditative thoughts that are caused as a result of these drawings or paintings, they are of serious nature. That is why he calls them cold pastoral. So the urn is cold. It is unconcerned with our plight, with the plight of the humans or the mortals. And he says, "When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man to whom thou sayest." Now the same thought continues. He says, "The urn induces deep thoughts about the fate of mankind." He says, "When the old age shall this generation waste," when our generation has died, he says, "and the next generation has taken our place, you shall remain, So this is the permanence of art. This is a permanence of art that Keats was talking about. He says, the urn is for all times. The urn will live on, but this generation, or Keats, will die. So this generation of human beings that is now impressed by the beauty of the art, it will die, but the art, but the urn, it will live, it will remain. In the midst of other woe than ours, and when there will be other kinds of problems than our generation has. The next generation will have their own kinds of problems. But he says this urn will always remain a friend to man. It will always, he says, he calls the urn a friend to man also. He says how, then he tells you how the urn will remain a friend to man. The reason is that it gives an important lesson. It has an important lesson to give to all generations of mankind. Not to Keats's own generation, but he says to all the upcoming generation, the urn will remain a friend because it gives them a message, it gives them a lesson. And the lesson is, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. And as I said in the opening of the lecture, these last two lines, they summarize the whole viewpoint of the poet. And the poet here describes to you what he's trying to say, through the whole of the poem. In the words of Keats, the message of the urn to human beings, to the mankind, is that beauty and truth cannot be separated. In beauty lies truth, and in truth lies beauty. He does not separate the two. For them, beauty and truth are not inseparable, just like the world of the urn. He's just now described to you an object of beauty, and he's described to you the beautiful world of the urn, and he says that it is this beautiful world, it is this beautiful object which holds the truth. So for Keats, the truth value is not separate from beauty. So beauty and truth are inseparable, and then he gives you his final verdict. He says, this is all that is important. This is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. And I will conclude these lines discussion with the words of Emily Lewis, who said that beauty is the only higher truth. And this is what Keats is also trying to explain through the poem. So with this, we now come to the end of the analysis of the poem. We've analyzed the poem line by line, and we've seen how Keats has tried to describe his philosophy of beauty, truth, and life, which I explained to you in the beginning of the poem. We shall analyze the different themes that emerge from this poem in the next lecture. We shall also look at the various concepts, complicated concepts that emerge from this poem in the next lecture also. So with this, I conclude this lecture, and we will take on the same discussion in the next lecture.